The blood was still fresh when Lieutenant Marcus Chen found her. She lay crumpled in the cargo hold's shadow, 12 feet of broken alien flesh pressed against the cold steel bulkhead. Her 6 arms were folded unnaturally beneath her massive frame, and the bioluminescent markings along her neck flickered like dying stars. The execution mark burned across her forehead, a brand the Sovereignty used on condemned slaves before processing. Marcus froze in the doorway of the abandoned freighter, his scanner still pinging the distress beacon that had pulled him off his patrol route. The Tuluxar female's chest rose and fell in shallow, desperate movements. Her 4 eyes tracked him with the glazed awareness of someone who'd already accepted death. "Medical to Deck 7, Marcus said into his comm, voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding his system. "Priority 1, Tuluxar female, critical condition." "Negative, Lieutenant." Commander Reeves's voice crackled back immediately. "Scans show an execution brand. Protocol requires immediate—" "She's alive." Marcus cut across the channel, something hard settling in his chest. "I'm invoking humanitarian override." Every human serving in the United Terran Fleet knew the stories about the Tuluxar, a warrior species that had dominated their sector for millennia until the Sovereignty conquered them 15 years ago. Now they existed as slaves, laborers, and occasionally, like this one, examples. "Stand down, Chen." "That's an order." Marcus looked at the alien woman's face, at the way her breathing hitched with each shallow gasp, at the purple blood seeping from the neural inhibitor collar embedded in her throat, the kind that made escape impossible and death slow. "Requesting permission to speak with Captain Okafor," he said quietly. Another pause, longer this time. "You're relieved of duty pending disciplinary review. Touch nothing." "I'm sending a containment team." Marcus stood in the doorway for 3 seconds, weighing 16 years of military service against the dying creature before him. Then he stepped forward, pulling the emergency medical kit from his belt. The Tuluxar's eyes widened as he approached, her lips pulled back, revealing rows of crystalline teeth designed for tearing meat. A warning growl rumbled from her chest cavity, weak but unmistakable. "Easy," Marcus said, raising his hands. "I'm going to help." She tried to move, her lower arms twitching with the effort. The inhibitor collar pulsed red, sending electrical current through her nervous system. Her growl became a strangled gasp of pain. Marcus had seen these collars before. Removing them without the proper codes triggered a kill switch that would liquefy her brain in seconds. But the medical kit contained a temporary bypass, illegal tech that the fleet pretended not to know about, used by medics in war zones when standard protocols failed. His hands were steady as he worked, attaching the bypass leads to the collar's control nodes. The Tuluxar watched him with those 4 unblinking eyes, her breathing growing more labored with each passing second. "Almost there," Marcus murmured, more to himself than her. The bypass activated with a soft chime. The collar's red pulse shifted to amber. Not deactivated, that was impossible, without sovereignty codes, but suppressed enough to stop the constant torture. The Tuluxar's whole body shuddered. Her breathing deepened, and for the first time her eyes focused with clear intelligence rather than pain-dulled instinct. "Why?" The word came out in heavily accented standard, rough as gravel but unmistakable. Before Marcus could answer, boots thundered in the corridor outside. He turned to see Commander Reeves flanked by 4 security officers in full containment gear, weapons drawn and pointed at the Tuluxar. "Step away from the condemned, Lieutenant," Reeves ordered, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone prepared to enforce compliance. Marcus didn't move. "She's under humanitarian protection, sir. I've filed the paperwork. That brand supersedes any protection you think you can invoke," Reeves gestured sharply. "This creature was sentenced by the Sovereignty under Treaty Article 7. Our agreement requires we uphold the Treaty of Mars," Marcus interrupted, his voice still calm, "which states that any being found alive within Terran jurisdiction has the right to asylum hearing before execution of foreign sentences." Reeves' jaw tightened. "You're citing a treaty clause that hasn't been invoked in 12 years. "Doesn't make it invalid, sir." The security officer shifted, uncertain. Behind Marcus, the Tuluxar made a sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a question. Then a new voice cut through the standoff, clear and carrying absolute authority despite its quiet tone. "Stand down, all personnel." Captain Nala Okafor stood in the doorway, her dark eyes taking in the scene with the practiced assessment of someone who'd commanded warships through 3 separate conflicts. She wore her dress uniform, which meant she'd been in negotiations with the sovereignty delegation currently docked at the station. Her gaze moved from Reeves to Marcus to the Talaxer, lingering on the execution brand and the jury-rigged collar bypass. "Lieutenant Chen," she said softly, "you've created an interesting situation." Marcus stood at attention. "Yes, ma'am." Okafor walked forward, her boots echoing in the sudden silence. She stopped 3 feet from the Talaxar, studying the alien woman with an expression that revealed nothing. The Talaxar stared back, her 4 eyes blazing with something that looked like defiance despite her broken body. "Can you stand?" Okafor asked her directly. The alien's response came after a long moment of visible struggle. "No." "Can you speak for yourself in a hearing?" This time the answer came faster. "Yes." Okafor nodded once, then turned to Reeves. "Commander, you will escort our guest to Medical Bay 3, full treatment protocols. Lieutenant Chen, you're with me?" Reeves looked like he'd been struck. "Captain, the Sovereignty Ambassador will consider this an act of—" "The Ambassador," Okafor said, her voice dropping to that particular register that made admirals reconsider their positions, "can lodge a formal complaint through proper channels. Until then, this being is under Terran protection pending asylum hearing. Are we clear?" The commander's face flushed, but he saluted. "Crystal, ma'am." As the security team moved in with the medical gurney, the Talaxar's eyes found Marcus again. She said nothing, but her lower right hand made a gesture, thumb and 2 fingers pressed together, then opening. In Talaxar culture, it meant debt acknowledged. Marcus returned the gesture, then followed his captain into the corridor. "Do you understand what you've started?" Okafor asked quietly as they walked. "Yes, ma'am. Do you understand what it might cost?" Marcus thought of those 4 eyes burning with desperate intelligence even as her body shut down. He thought of the execution brand and the casual cruelty it represented.
"Yes, ma'am, I do."
Okafor's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, not quite a smile but something close to approval. "Because in 6 hours that Talaxar goes before a tribunal, and you're going to help me prove that humanity doesn't recognize anyone as disposable." She paused at an intersection, her gaze sharp. "Not even our enemies' slaves." The implications settled like stones in deep water. The Sovereignty controlled 47 systems and had military superiority in this sector. Humanity had survived the last 2 decades through careful diplomacy and strategic deference. Challenging an execution order wasn't just politically dangerous, it was potentially catastrophic. Marcus met his captain's eyes and saw the same calculation he'd made in that cargo hold. "Understood, Captain. Then let's get to work." Sarah Kim stared at the readings coming from her newest patient and reached for the emergency xenobiology protocols she'd hoped never to use. The Talaxar's physiology was shutting down and cascading failure, her triple heart system struggling against the neural damage from the inhibitor collar. "I need the Xeno specialist team now," Sarah called out, her hands already moving through triage procedures, "and someone get me the Sovereignty medical database access codes." Her assistant, a young ensign fresh from medical school, hesitated. "Doctor, those codes are classified for diplomatic. This being is dying on my table. Get me the codes or get out of my bay." The ensign ran. Sarah worked in focused silence, stabilizing what she could while her equipment struggled to interpret alien biology that human medicine had rarely treated as anything but enemy combatants. The Talaxar's eyes tracked her movements with disturbing awareness. "You should have let me die," the alien rasped. "They will come for me." "You cannot protect the Savior's strength," Sarah interrupted, not looking up from the neural monitor. "You can philosophize after I've stopped your brain from hemorrhaging." The Talaxar's mouth opened. Whether to argue or thank her, Sarah would never know, because that's when the medical bay doors exploded inward. 4 Sovereignty enforcers burst through, their powered armor gleaming black, weapons already tracking targets. The lead enforcer's voice boomed through external speakers, translated into harsh standard. "Surrender the condemned to Sovereignty authority. Resistance will be met with lethal force." Sarah's hand moved to the emergency lockdown, but froze. The enforcers had positioned themselves between her and every exit. Behind her, the Talaxar made a sound like breaking glass, either laughter or a death rattle. "I told you," the alien whispered. Then a small figure stepped between Sarah and the enforcers. Kira Okafor was 7 years old, dark-eyed and solemn, wearing the visitor badge her mother had given her for today's tour of the ship. She'd been waiting in the observation room, watching the medical procedures with the intense curiosity she brought to everything. Now she stood in the center of the medical bay, small and fragile in the shadow of 4 armored killers. "No," she said clearly. Every adult in the room froze. The lead enforcer's helmet tilted down toward her. Child, move aside. This does not concern you. Her hands were steady at her sides, her posture an unconscious mirror of her mother's command stance. She's hurt, Kira said. You can't take hurt people. That's wrong. Somewhere in the station's command center, alarms were screaming. Security feeds showed the confrontation in Medical Bay 3 broadcasting to every terminal on the ship. Captain Okafor was already running, her heart hammering against her ribs in cold terror, because her daughter, her baby, was standing between armed sovereignty enforcers and their condemned prisoner. In the medical bay, the lead enforcer stepped forward. His gauntleted hand reached toward Kira. Move, child. Final warning. Kira looked up at him, then back at the Tlaxar on the medical table. The alien's 4 eyes were wide. All her pain and fear crystallized into this single moment of watching the human child defend her. My mom says we don't hurt people who can't fight back, Kira said. And she's the captain, so you have to listen to her rules. The enforcer's hand hovered inches from Kira's shoulder. Through his helmet's external speakers, his breathing sounded like industrial machinery. Then another voice cut through the tension, calm, controlled, and absolutely lethal in its quiet intensity. If you touch my daughter, Captain Okafor said from the doorway, there will be war. Okafor stood flanked by Marcus and a full security detail, weapons drawn but held at ready positions rather than aimed. The diplomatic calculus was impossible: escalate and risk sector-wide conflict, or back down and show weakness that would ripple through every human colony. But a mother's calculus was simple. The lead enforcer turned his helmet toward Okafor. The child interfered with sovereignty justice. Under treaty provisions, you have no authority to enter Terran medical facilities without permission, Okafor said. Each word carried the weight of 16 years commanding warships. You have violated our sovereignty. Remove yourselves immediately, or I will have you removed. The condemned belongs to the sovereignty. The condemned is currently under medical treatment in Terran jurisdiction. Your claim will be addressed at the tribunal. Okafor's gaze never wavered. Now get away from my daughter. The silence stretched. Through the observation windows, Sarah could see crew members gathering, drawn by the security alerts and the spreading news that Captain Okafor's child had confronted sovereignty enforcers. The lead enforcer's helmet turned back to Kira. The girl stood perfectly still, her small frame radiating the kind of courage that comes from not yet understanding how fragile she truly was. This is not finished, the enforcer said finally. He gestured to his team and they withdrew in synchronized movements, their armor servos hissing. But at the doorway, he paused. The child has made an enemy of the sovereignty. We remember such things. Okafor crossed the medical bay in 4 strides and pulled Kira against her, her hands shaking as she held her daughter. Don't ever do that again, she whispered into Kira's hair. Don't you ever? But you would have, Kira said simply. Okafor pulled back, looking into her daughter's eyes, and saw the terrible truth there. Yes, she would have. She had spent her entire career making these calculations, weighing lives against politics, but seeing it reflected in her 7-year-old's face made her chest constrict with something between pride and grief. On the medical table, the Tlaxar watched this exchange with all 4 eyes. When Okafor finally turned toward her, the alien spoke in a voice stronger than it should have been. Your child spoke for me. In my culture, this creates takmar, a debt that passes through generations. She paused, each breath labored. I am Jekar of the Shattered Mountain clan. I was marked for slaughter because I refused to reveal my people's sacred sites to sovereignty mining operations. 300 of my clan died protecting those places. I am the last. The words fell into the medical bay like stones into still water. Okafor felt the weight of them, the shape of what this moment would become. A condemned Traxar warrior, a child's act of compassion, the sovereignty's fury. All of it converging into something that would either break Terran sovereignty relations or forge them into something new. Dr. Kim, she said quietly. Status? Sarah looked at her monitors, at the impossible tangle of alien physiology and failing systems. She's stabilized, but the neural damage from the inhibitor collar is extensive. I need another 6 hours minimum before she's safe to transport, and I'm not sure she'll survive the tribunal even if we get there. Okafor turned to Marcus. Lieutenant, you're going to tell me everything you know about Treaty of Mars Asylum provisions. Every clause, every precedent, every loophole we can use. Captain Reeves appeared in the doorway, his face ashen, The sovereignty ambassador is demanding an immediate meeting. He's threatening to withdraw from the treaty entirely if we don't surrender the prisoner within the hour. Okafor looked at Jakar, then at Kira, then back at her first officer. Tell the ambassador I'll meet him in 2 hours, and tell him to bring the full text of the treaty. He's going to need it. Okafor retreated to her ready room with Marcus, pulling up every legal document that governed human sovereignty relations. Kira was secured in protective custody, safely away from the diplomatic firestorm she'd ignited. Dr. Kim worked frantically to stabilize Jakar's failing systems, her medical bay now ringed with security. And throughout the station, crew members whispered about the captain's daughter standing down sovereignty enforcers to protect an alien marked for execution. When Okafor finally entered the conference room to face Ambassador Krethik, she did so with Marcus at her right and a tablet containing 3 centuries of human legal precedent at her left. Krethik was a Vrin, a species that had allied with the sovereignty 70 years ago and now served as its primary diplomatic corps. He had crystalline features that refracted light in unsettling patterns and a voice that carried harmonic undertones designed to induce submission in most species. Captain Okafor, your child assaulted sovereignty personnel. The condemned you harbor murdered 17 sovereignty citizens, and you invoke obsolete treaty language to shield both. Each word resonated with carefully calibrated displeasure. Explain why I should not recommend immediate cessation of all diplomatic relations, Okafor said, her movements deliberate. Because you're smarter than that, Ambassador. You know exactly what invoking the Treaty of Mars Asylum Clause means, and you know it's not obsolete, just inconvenient. The condemned carries an execution brand. This supersedes Exer. The execution brand was applied in sovereignty space. The moment Lieutenant Chen found Jakar in that cargo hold, she entered Terran jurisdiction, at which point she became eligible for asylum hearing under Mars Treaty Article 12, Section 4. Okafor slid the tablet across the table. I believe you were present when this treaty was ratified. You signed it yourself. The silence that followed was bitter. You are hiding behind legal technicalities to protect a murderer, critics said finally. I'm upholding a treaty that has kept our peoples from open war for 43 years. If you want to call that hiding, go ahead.
Okafor leaned forward. But let me be clear, Ambassador, that Talaxar is dying in my medical bay.
She has 6, maybe 8 hours before her systems fail completely. I'm not asking you to pardon her. I'm asking you to let her speak for herself before a tribunal, as the treaty requires. If she's found guilty by proper legal process, she accepts her sentence. If she's found to have been wrongly condemned, she gets sanctuary. There is no question of her guilt. She killed sovereignty citizens in defense of religious sites that were legally acquired through conquest. Then you have nothing to fear from a tribunal. Okafor held his gaze. Unless you're concerned that the full details of how those sites were acquired might not reflect well under legal scrutiny, Krethik's features went very still. You are making dangerous accusations, Captain. That's all. Okafor stood. The tribunal convenes in 6 hours. You can present your evidence, we'll present ours, and the tribunal board will make their ruling. Unless you'd prefer to withdraw from the treaty entirely and explain to the Sovereignty High Council why you threw away 4 decades of diplomatic progress over one dying Tlaxar. Finally, he inclined his head in a gesture that might have been acquiescence or might have been a promise of future retribution. But understand, Captain, if this tribunal does not result in the condemned's execution, there will be consequences that extend far beyond your station. After he left, Marcus exhaled slowly. We just backed the sovereignty into a legal corner. They're going to come at us with everything they have. I know. Okafor stared at the conference room's viewport, watching distant ships drift through the black. Start pulling every record of sovereignty mining operations in the Shattered Mountain region. If Jakar was protecting sacred sites, I want to know exactly what the sovereignty did to legally acquire them. Captain, if we expose atrocities, we're not just challenging an execution. We're challenging the entire framework of sovereignty conquest law. Okafor thought of Kira standing small and resolute between enforcers and their prey. Thought of Jakar's eyes, burning with desperate intelligence. Thought of Marcus risking his career because leaving someone to die violated something fundamental in his nature. Then I guess we better make sure our evidence is airtight, she said quietly, because we're about to find out if humanity really means what we say about sapient rights, or if it's just comfortable rhetoric when it doesn't cost us anything. The tribunal board assembled in the station's formal hearing chamber, a space designed for mediating trade disputes and minor diplomatic incidents, now pressed into service for something far more significant. 3 judges. 1 human, 1 Vrin representing sovereignty interests, and one Halin, a neutral species respected throughout the sector for their commitment to jurisprudence. Jakar was brought in on a medical gurney, Dr. Kim walking beside her with portable monitors tracking her deteriorating systems. The Talaxar's eyes were clear despite her pain, her massive frame somehow diminished by injury but not defeated. Ambassador Krathik sat at the prosecution table with 4 legal advisors, their tablets glowing with prepared arguments and precedent. Okafor and Marcus occupied the defense position, their evidence compiled through 6 hours of desperate research. And in the observation gallery, secured behind reinforced glass, Kira sat with her hands pressed against the transparent barrier, watching. The Haleen judge, an elderly being named Thmora, whose long career had spanned dozens of interspecies conflicts, activated the tribunal's recording systems. This hearing will determine whether the being designated as Jakar of the Shattered Mountain Clan qualifies for asylum under Treaty of Mars protocols, or whether she will be remanded to Sovereignty Authority for execution of lawful sentence. Ambassador Kratik, present your case. What followed was brutal in its efficiency. Kratik displayed evidence of the 17 Sovereignty citizens killed when Shakar and her clan attacked a mining facility. Surveillance footage showed Tlaxar warriors tearing through security forces with savage efficiency. Medical reports detailed the deaths, quick, violent, and undeniably Jakar's responsibility. This being is not a political prisoner or a conscientious objector, Kratik concluded. She is a murderer who killed 17 people in an act of terrorism against legitimate sovereignty operations. The execution brand is legally applied under sovereignty law, and her crimes warrant no mercy. Marcus shifted uncomfortably, knowing how thin their defense would seem against such clear-cut violence. But Okafor stood calmly. Your Honor, we don't dispute that Jakar killed those 17 people. What we dispute is the characterization of those killings as terrorism, rather than legitimate resistance to war crimes. Krathik's features flickered with what might have been amusement. War crimes? The Shattered Mountain region was conquered 15 years ago. The resistance ended. These were murders committed against lawful authority built on genocide. Okafor activated her tablet, and the tribunal's displays lit up with images that made even the Haleen judge go very still. The Shattered Mountain region, before sovereignty conquest, a network of crystalline caverns that the Tlaxar had declared sacred for millennia, built around natural formations that created harmonic resonances used in their most important religious ceremonies. The same region, after sovereignty mining operations, collapsed caverns, shattered formations, and systematic destruction of every site that Tlaxar had designated as holy. The sovereignty didn't just conquer the Shattered Mountains, Okafor said quietly. They deliberately destroyed every religious site in the region, rendering them permanently unusable. This wasn't collateral damage from resource extraction, it was systematic cultural annihilation designed to break Tlaxar resistance. She pulled up more evidence. Internal sovereignty communications discussing the strategic value of destroying Tlaxar morale through targeting sacred sites. Casualty reports showing 300 Tlaxar killed defending the caverns, many of them unarmed religious leaders. Zakar's clan made a final stand to protect the last intact sacred site in the entire region. The 17 sovereignty citizens she killed were members of a demolition team specifically tasked with destroying that site. Okafor's voice remained level, but something hard edged into it. Under the Geneva Conventions, which the Treaty of Mars explicitly incorporates, deliberate destruction of religious sites during conflict constitutes a war crime. Resistance to such destruction is legally protected. The tribunal chamber went absolutely silent. Krathik stood slowly, his harmonic voice losing its carefully maintained diplomacy. You cite ancient human law to question sovereignty authority? We are not bound by your primitive conventions. You are when you sign treaties that incorporate them, Thmora said quietly, her gaze moving between the evidence on display. The Treaty of Mars Article 7 specifically states that both parties agreed to uphold basic conventions of lawful warfare as defined by human and sovereignty legal traditions. Captain Okafor's citation is relevant. This is absurd. Krathik's features blazed with refracted light. The Tlaxar resisted conquest for decades. Breaking their cultural identity was a military necessity. That's an interesting defense, Okafor said softly. Since it's exactly what the Nuremberg trials rejected 300 years ago, military necessity doesn't justify genocide, Ambassador. Not for humans, and not for the sovereignty. The implications detonated through the chamber. What had started as a simple asylum hearing was becoming something far more dangerous, a formal legal challenge to the entire framework of sovereignty conquest doctrine. The Vryn judge leaned forward, his features showing distress. Captain Okafor, you understand what you're arguing? If this tribunal rules that sovereignty mining operations constituted war crimes, it calls into question every conquered system under sovereignty control. Yes, Your Honor. I understand completely. Okafor looked at Jakar, still lying on her medical gurney, 4 eyes blazing with something between hope and disbelief. But the alternative is ruling that genocide is acceptable if it's militarily convenient. And I don't think this tribunal wants that precedent on record. Thamora studied the evidence for a long moment, her ancient eyes moving across images of shattered sacred sites and casualty reports. Finally, she spoke. This tribunal will recess for 2 hours while we review the evidence presented. All parties will remain available for questioning. As the judges withdrew, Krethik crossed to Okafor, his voice dropping to a deadly harmonic that only she could hear. You have made an enemy of the entire sovereignty today, Captain. Whatever this tribunal rules, you will pay for this challenge. Then I guess I'm in good company. In the observation gallery, Kira pressed her small hands against the glass and whispered something too quiet for anyone to hear. But Jakar, with her enhanced Talaxar hearing, caught the words across the chamber. Please let her be okay. The Talaxar's eyes found the child, and something ancient shifted in her expression. Recognition of a debt that transcended species, culture, and the political machinations of empires. Mora looked older than she had before, the weight of the decision etched into her features. This tribunal has reviewed the evidence presented regarding sovereignty operations in the Shattered Mountain region. We find that the systematic destruction of Talaxar sacred sites, as documented in internal sovereignty communications, constitutes deliberate cultural annihilation and violation of Geneva Convention provisions incorporated into the Treaty of Mars. Your Honor, this is... Be silent, Ambassador. Thamora's voice carried absolute authority. We further find that Jakar's actions, while violent, occurred in defense of the last remaining sacred site in her people's ancestral territory against a demolition team with explicit orders to destroy it. Under the circumstances, her resistance constitutes legally protected action rather than terrorism. Sovereignty legal advisors shouted objections. The human judge looked torn between relief and terror at the implications. And Jakar on her medical gurney made a sound like breaking glass that might have been weeping. However, Thamora continued, her voice cutting through the chaos, this tribunal also recognizes that 17 sovereignty citizens died in the incident. While Zakar's actions were legally protected, they were not without cost. Therefore, this tribunal rules as follows. Zakar will be granted asylum in Terran jurisdiction. The execution brand is hereby declared invalid, but she will serve a period of supervised probation and will be required to participate in truth and reconciliation proceedings regarding the deaths of the 17 sovereignating citizens. This is not justice, Krethik said, his voice vibrating with fury. This is political theater designed to humiliate the sovereignty. This is law, Ambassador, Thamora replied. If you wish to challenge it, you may appeal through proper channels, but the ruling stands. As security moved to escort Jikar back to Medical Bay, the Talaxar's eyes found Okafor across the chamber. She made the gesture again, thumb and 2 fingers pressed together, then opening, but this time accompanied by words in her native language that the translator struggled with before settling on. Blood debt acknowledged. Life debt sworn. Edmund Dais swore a safe deal at Akira's small face pressed against the glass and repeated the gesture with even more solemnity. In the aftermath, as the sovereignty delegation withdrew in cold fury and the station buzzed with news of the unprecedented ruling, Okafor found Marcus standing at a viewport staring at the stars. We just started something that won't end in this room, he said quietly. I know. Okafor stood beside him, watching distant ships maneuver through the black. The sovereignty will challenge this ruling in every court they can access. They'll make examples of other systems. They'll push back hard against any attempt to expand this precedent. Was it worth it? Okafor thought of Kira, standing small and fearless between enforcers and their condemned prey. Thought of Jakar's 4 eyes, blazing with desperate intelligence and unexpected hope. Thought of 300 Talaxar dying to protect sacred caves, and 17 sovereignty citizens caught in the machinery of empire. Ask me in 10 years, she said finally. When we see whether this moment becomes a footnote or a turning point. 3 days later, Dr. Kim declared Jakar stable enough for the inhibitor collar's final removal, a delicate procedure that required sovereignty access codes grudgingly provided under tribunal order. The Talaxar warrior sat on the edge of the medical bed, her 12-foot frame finally free of the neural torture device that had defined her last months. Kira was there, sitting cross-legged on a chair that was too big for her, watching with solemn intensity. "Does it hurt anymore?" the girl asked. Jakar touched the scarred flesh where the collar had been embedded. "No, small one. Thanks to your healers, the pain ends." "Good." Kira nodded seriously. Then, with the directness of children, "Why did they want to kill you?" The question hung in the air. Sarah Kim started to intervene, but Jakar raised one massive hand in a stopping gesture. "Because I would not let them destroy what my people held sacred," the Talaxar said quietly. "And because, when given the choice between surviving as slaves or dying as warriors, my clan chose death." Jakar's expression shifted into something that might have been a smile on her alien features. "No, small one. Because you spoke for me when death marked my head. In my culture, this creates takmer, a bond deeper than blood, stronger than steel. You are Talaxar now, in all ways that matter, and I am sworn to your protection until the stars grow cold." Kira considered this with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. "Does that mean you're like my auntie?" The question startled a sound from Jakar that was definitely laughter, harsh and unused, but genuine. "Yes, small warrior, like your auntie, if aunties are sworn to tear apart any threat that comes near their clan." Sarah Kim watched this exchange with growing concern, already imagining the diplomatic complications of a Talaxar warrior declaring blood bond with the captain's daughter. But before she could voice her objections, Okafor's voice came from the medical bay entrance. "Ambassador Kratik is requesting one final meeting before his delegation departs," she said, her expression unreadable. Then, looking at Jakar, "He specifically asked that you be present." Kratik sat alone this time, without his legal team, his crystalline features refracting light in patterns that suggested something between resignation and calculation. Jakar stood behind Okafor, her massive frame still weak from injury but radiating the controlled violence of a born warrior. Marcus flanked them, his hand resting casually near his sidearm. "Captain Okafor, Jakar of the Shattered Mountain Clan." Kratif inclined his head in what might have been respect, or might have been mockery. "I wanted to speak before my departure, to clarify certain matters." "Speak then," Okafor said. "The tribunal's ruling will not stand in the long term. The Sovereignty High Council will challenge it through every legal avenue available. We will find judges more sympathetic to our position, precedents that contradict your Geneva Conventions, diplomatic pressure that makes maintaining this ruling politically untenable." Krathik's harmonic voice carried absolute certainty. "You have won a battle, Captain, but the war will grind you down. Or possibly this ruling becomes the foundation for dozens more like it. Possibly other conquered species start citing it in their own resistance efforts. Possibly the sovereignty finds that the machinery of empire is harder to maintain when its legal underpinnings are challenged in open court." "You would destabilize the entire sector over one Tlaxer warrior? I would uphold the law over one being's life." "That's not destabilization, Ambassador. That's civilization." Krathik's features flickered rapidly, a sign of intense emotion in his species. When he spoke again, his voice had lost some of its harmonic manipulation, becoming almost honest. "I served in the Shattered Mountain campaign, Captain. I saw what we did there. I justified it as military necessity, as breaking enemy morale, as the price of conquest." He paused, something like regret edging into his words. "But I also saw the Talaxar defending those caverns, saw them die rather than abandon places that meant nothing strategically but everything spiritually. And I told myself they were primitive, that their attachments were obstacles to progress." "And now?" Okafor asked quietly. "Now I wonder if the price of empire is higher than we admit." Krathik looked at Jakar directly for the first time. "Your clan died well, warrior. That is poor comfort, but it is truth. They fought with honor we did not acknowledge." Jakar's four eyes blazed. For a moment violence trembled in the air between them. Then, with visible effort, she inclined her head in the Talaxar gesture of recognition. "You speak truth, Vryn. That changes nothing, but it is acknowledged." Krathik stood. "The sovereignty will fight this ruling with everything we have. But I will make one recommendation to the High Council. that we review all outstanding execution orders for cultural resistance cases. Not because the tribunal compels it, but because, he trailed off, his features showing patterns Sarah's xenopsychology training recognized as deep uncertainty. Because perhaps empire should not require the complete annihilation of those it conquers. After he left, the three of them sat in silence for a long moment. That, Marcus said finally, was possibly the strangest diplomatic concession I've ever witnessed. It wasn't a concession, Okafor replied. It was an admission that we've created a crack in their certainty. Whether that crack widens or gets sealed over, that's the question. Zakar rumbled something in her native language, then switched to standard. In Tlaxar history, great changes often begin with single moments of defiance. A warrior refusing to kneel, a clan choosing death over submission. A child standing between predator and prey. Her gaze moved toward Medical Bay, where Kira was surely still waiting. Perhaps this is such a moment. 4 other species under sovereignty control had filed asylum claims, citing the Shattered Mountain precedent. The Sovereignty High Council had initiated formal review of cultural resistance cases, though whether to address them or to find ways around the tribunal ruling remained unclear. And on the station designated as Marcus Chen's original patrol route, now officially recognized as a Terran asylum sanctuary, Jakar stood in the cargo bay that had once been her execution chamber. The space had been converted into a training facility where the Tlaxar warrior taught hand-to-hand combat to Terran security forces who wanted to understand alien fighting styles, but today her only student was a 7-year-old girl with serious eyes and her mother's determination. Stance wider, Jakar instructed, her massive hand gently adjusting Kira's feet. You are too small to match strength, so you must be immovable like stone. From the observation window, Okafor watched her daughter training with an alien warrior marked for slaughter, saved by one human's choice and one child's courage, and wondered what kind of future they'd set in motion. Marcus appeared beside her, carrying a data tablet. New report from the Sovereignty Review Committee. They've commuted 17 execution orders for cultural resistance cases, transferred them to probationary status pending reconciliation proceedings. 17, Okafor repeated quietly. 17 lives because Zakar survived to testify about what happened in the Shattered Mountains. 17 lives because you backed a sovereignty ambassador into a legal corner, because a 7-year-old stood down armed enforcers. Because I couldn't leave someone to die in a cargo hold. Marcus smiled slightly. We make a decent team. Below them, Jakar was demonstrating a defensive sequence, her movements precise despite her size. Kira mimicked each motion with fierce concentration, stumbling occasionally but refusing to quit. She's going to grow up in a universe that knows her name, Okafor said softly. The human child who created Takmar with the Tlaxar warrior, the girl who stood between the sovereignty and their condemned. I'm not sure if I've given her a legacy or a target. Both, probably, Marcus replied honestly. But she'll handle it. She's your daughter. They stood in comfortable silence watching the training session below, and as Kira finally executed the defensive sequence perfectly, earning a rumbling sound of approval from her massive instructor, Okafor allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had started something that would outlast the immediate political consequences. In the cargo bay, Jakar placed one massive hand on Kira's shoulder, the gesture formal and reverent. You have learned well, small warrior. Your Takmar does you honor. Kira beamed up at her, sweat streaking her face. Does that mean I'm Traxer now? For real? For real? Jakar confirmed solemnly. And when you are grown, I will teach you the warrior songs of the Shattered Mountain clan, so that what was destroyed might live again in new voices. Above them, Okafor felt tears prick at her eyes, not from sadness, but from the weight of witnessing something profound. A species nearly annihilated passing their songs to a human child. A warrior marked for slaughter, finding purpose in protecting the one who'd spoken for her. An empire's certainty, cracked by the simple act of refusing to look away from suffering. The future that moment created would unfold across decades, through diplomatic battles and legal precedents, through other species finding courage in the Shattered Mountain ruling, through Kira growing into a woman who carried both human and Tlaxar honor in her bones. But it had started here, in a cargo hold where Marcus Chen found a dying alien and chose compassion over protocol, in a medical bay where a child stood between killers and their prey. In a conference room where a captain backed an empire into a corner with nothing but law and conviction, humanity, fuck yeah. Not because they were stronger or smarter or more advanced, but because, when confronted with cruelty dressed as necessity, they'd looked at the condemned and said, no, not today. Not while we can do something about it. And sometimes, when the moment was right and the stakes were clear, that was enough to change everything.